After enduring police attacks, 156 black U.S. soldiers grabbed their rifles and marched for justice. The army called it mutiny, conducted the largest, most flawed trial in history, and secretly hanged 19 of its own men. This is the story of the Houston Riot and the century it took to admit the truth. August 23, 1917. In the scorching Texas heat, Corporal Charles Baltimore, a military policeman with the 24th Infantry Regiment, approached two Houston police officers to ask about an arrested soldier. Officer Lee Sparks struck him with a pistol, fired 3 shots as Baltimore fled, then beat him again. Within hours, 156 black soldiers would march into Houston armed with rifles. By sunrise, 19 people would be dead, and America would conduct the largest mass execution of its own soldiers in history. The story begins not in Houston, but across decades of distinguished service. The 24th Infantry Regiment was formed in November 1869, one of 4 all-black units created by Congress after the Civil War. These were the Buffalo Soldiers, named by the Native Americans who fought them on the frontier. For nearly 50 years, they'd served with honor across the American West, battling outlaws, protecting settlers, building roads. They'd fought in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, were among the first to raise the flag at San Juan Hill. They'd served in the Philippines, guarded the Mexican border during Pancho Villa's raids. These weren't inexperienced troops. They were professional soldiers who'd proven themselves in combat again and again. 2 men from the 24th had earned the Medal of Honor. The regiment had compiled what one historian called an enviable military record. But in the summer of 1917, that legacy was about to collide with the brutal reality of Jim Crow Texas. On July 28, 1917, the 3rd Battalion of the 24th Infantry Regiment arrived by train in Houston. There were 656 enlisted men and 8 white officers under the command of Major Neeland Snow. Their mission seemed straightforward: guard the construction of Camp Logan, a new National Guard training facility being built 5 miles west of the city. The soldiers stepped off the train into a different world than the one they'd left in New Mexico. Houston in 1917 was strictly segregated. Jim Crow laws enforced a racial caste system that separated every aspect of life. Different drinking fountains, different sections on streetcars, different restaurants, schools, swimming pool. Blacks were expected to step off sidewalks when whites approached, to address all whites as sir or ma'am, regardless of age, to never make eye contact, to accept insults without response. Many of the soldiers had grown up in the South and understood these unwritten rules, but they were also United States Army soldiers, wearing the uniform of their country. They'd expected that military service would shield them from at least the worst indignities. They were wrong. From the moment they arrived, the harassment began. White construction workers at Camp Logan hurled racial slurs. Civilians on the streets spat insults. The soldiers were forced to use segregated facilities at their own construction site. On public streetcars, they were ordered to the back, even while in uniform. But the real problem was the Houston Police Department. The department had 159 officers. 2 were black. Relations between the police and Houston's black community, which numbered about 30,000, were already terrible. The recently appointed police chief, Clarence Brock, had previously run the Parks Department and was neither respected nor liked by many of his own officers. The city government was in disarray after the mayor had dropped dead shortly after firing the previous, well-liked police chief. Among the Houston officers, 2 had earned particular reputations in the black community: Lee Sparks and Rufus Daniels. Both were known for brutality. Both were known for their hatred, and both were about to ignite a powder keg. The soldiers began to resist. Unlike Houston's civilian black population, these men had been trained to fight. They refused to sit in the back of streetcars. They disobeyed segregation laws. They talked back when insulted, and the police responded with violence. In the weeks following their arrival, soldiers were repeatedly beaten and arrested. In early August, 2 detectives boarded a streetcar and beat 2 soldiers in front of other passengers. The attacks were systematic, designed to break the soldiers' spirit, to remind them that the uniform meant nothing, that in Texas they were still just black men. Colonel William Newman, the battalion's original commander, recognized the danger. He formally requested that his unit be reassigned, citing the pervasive racism. His request was denied. Then, on August 23rd, the tension that had been building for a month reached its breaking point. It started around noon in the San Felipe district, Houston's predominantly black neighborhood. Officers Sparks and Daniels fired warning shots to disperse what they claimed was an illegal gathering on a street corner. When people scattered, Sparks burst into the home of Sarah Travers, a local black woman. He didn't find who he was chasing, but he dragged Travers outside anyway, barefoot and partially dressed, arrested her for hiding suspects. Private Alonzo Edwards, a soldier on leave, approached and offered to take custody of Travers so she could get dressed. Sparks's response was immediate and brutal. He pistol-whipped Edwards repeatedly, then arrested him too. According to witnesses, Sparks said, "That's the way we do things in the South. We're running things, not the damned N." That afternoon, Corporal Charles Baltimore learned what had happened. As one of the battalion's 12 military policemen, it was his duty to check on Edwards's welfare. Baltimore was a respected soldier, a model NCO. When he found Sparks and Daniels and asked about Edwards, Sparks exploded. What happened next would be disputed in the trials that followed, but the basic facts were clear. Sparks struck Baltimore over the head with his pistol. Baltimore ran. Sparks fired 3 shots at him. Baltimore fled into a nearby house. Sparks and Daniels chased him down, dragged him from under a bed, beat him again, and hauled him to the police station. Back at Camp Logan, word spread quickly, but the message that reached the soldiers was wrong. Someone said Baltimore had been shot and killed. The anger that swept through the battalion was immediate and visceral. These men had endured a month of harassment, insults, and beatings. They'd watched their fellow soldiers assaulted by police. They'd been trained to fight, yet ordered to accept abuse without response. And now, the rumor said, Houston police had murdered one of their military policemen. Small groups began meeting, venting their rage, discussing what to do. Major Snow learned about Baltimore's arrest and managed to get him released. An officer brought Baltimore back to camp, battered but alive, hoping this would calm the soldiers. It was too late. Another rumor was spreading through the camp. A white mob was coming to kill them. This wasn't paranoia. Just 6 weeks earlier, on July 2nd and 3rd, the city of East St. Louis, Illinois, had erupted in one of the deadliest race massacres in American history. White mobs had rampaged through black neighborhoods, shooting, beating, lynching, and burning people alive. Men, women, and children had been pulled from streetcars and beaten to death in the streets. Estimates of the death toll ranged from 40 to over 150. The violence had lasted for days, while police and National Guard troops either participated or stood by. The soldiers at Camp Logan knew about East St. Louis. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen the photographs in newspapers. And now they were hearing that armed whites were coming for them. Major Snow ordered all passes revoked, and the guard around Camp Logan increased. He ordered his first sergeants to collect all rifles and search for loose ammunition. He was trying to prevent what he knew was coming. But as soldiers gathered to turn in their weapons, someone fired a shot into the air and shouted, "Here they come!" Order collapsed instantly. Soldiers mobbed the supply tents, grabbing rifles and ammunition. Shots rang out in all directions. The officers tried to restore control, but their authority had evaporated. These men had reached a breaking point that decades of military discipline couldn't contain. First Sergeant Vida Henry, a career soldier, tried initially to stop the men from arming themselves, but at some point, he made a decision. If his soldiers were going to march into Houston, he would lead them. At least that way, there might be some discipline, some control. Around 8:30 p.m., approximately 156 soldiers fell into formation. They filled canteens, grabbed extra ammunition, and began their march toward Houston. Their stated objective: confront the police about the persistent violence, and if Baltimore was alive, secure his release. If he was dead, some soldiers vowed revenge. What followed was 2 hours of chaos and tragedy. The column marched through neighborhoods on the outskirts of Houston, firing at houses with outdoor lights. They were angry, frightened, convinced they were about to be attacked. Some were looking for sparks, specifically. Others were just shooting in the dark, literally and figuratively, on a night that witnesses described as rainy and nearly pitch black. They fired on a car carrying 2 white occupants. They marched 2.5 miles before encountering any police officers. The Houston Police Department had fatally miscalculated. Believing the black soldiers couldn't possibly arm themselves, they'd sent officers out in small numbers. When a group of 6 officers stumbled upon the armed column in the darkness, the soldiers opened fire. Officer Rufus Daniels, one of the men who'd beaten Baltimore earlier that day, was shot down. His body was stabbed with bayonets. 2 other officers were killed in the initial exchange. A third would die from his wounds. As the column continued through Houston, an open-topped car approached carrying a man in an olive-drab uniform. In the darkness and confusion, the soldiers believed they were seeing a mounted police officer. They opened fire. Only later did they discover they'd killed Captain Joseph Matz of the Illinois National Guard, a white army officer trying to respond to the disturbance. That killing changed everything. The soldiers knew what killing a white army officer meant. This wasn't resistance to police brutality anymore. This was mutiny. This was murder. And in 1917 America, there would be no mercy for black soldiers who'd crossed that line. The column began to fall apart. Soldiers deserted in groups, heading back to camp or trying to disappear into the night. Sergeant Henry led the remainder on a march back toward Camp Logan. Just outside the San Felipe district, he shook hands with the remaining soldiers and told them he planned to end his own life. By the time the shooting stopped around 10:30 p.m, the casualties were devastating. 4 police officers dead, 1 more mortally wounded, 11 civilians dead, including a white child named Fred Winkler, 4 soldiers dead, 2 from friendly fire, 12 others wounded. The next morning, Houston was placed under martial law. The remaining soldiers at Camp Logan were disarmed. A house-to-house search uncovered soldiers hiding in the San Felipe district. Within 48 hours, the entire 3rd Battalion was loaded onto trains and shipped back to New Mexico. But the reckoning was just beginning. The Army immediately began planning courts-martial. General John Wilson Ruckman, commanding general of the Southern Department, was, according to historians, especially anxious for the courts-martial to begin. The Army wanted swift justice. What they delivered was something else entirely. 118 soldiers were charged with mutiny, murder, and assault. The Army decided to try them in 3 separate courts-martial at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. The first trial alone would involve 63 defendants, making it the largest court-martial in American military history. The proceedings were rushed and fundamentally flawed from the start. A single officer, Major Harry Greer, was appointed to represent all 63 defendants in the first trial. Greer was not a lawyer. He was given 10 days to prepare. 10 days to prepare a defense for 63 men facing death sentences in the largest murder trial in American history. During the trial, Greer never raised the issue of race. He never challenged the climate of police brutality that had led to the confrontation. He made public statements suggesting that the mutiny had been proven before the trial even concluded. The trial began on November 1st, 1917. Almost 200 witnesses testified over 22 days. The transcripts totaled more than 2,000 pages. Much of the testimony came from soldiers who'd been granted immunity or promised leniency in exchange for testifying against their fellow soldiers. At least 8 soldiers agreed to testify against the others in exchange for clemency. But there was a fundamental problem with the prosecution's case: identification. The riot had occurred on a dark, rainy night. Most witnesses couldn't reliably identify specific soldiers. Many simply testified that they'd seen soldiers in the area, or heard gunfire, or assumed certain men must have been involved because of their positions in the unit. The darkness that night made positive identification nearly impossible, yet the court accepted testimony about who had fired specific shots, who had given specific orders, who had committed specific murders. On November 28th, after deliberating for just 2 days, the court found 58 of the 63 defendants guilty. 13 were sentenced to death. 43 received life imprisonment. 2 were acquitted. 1 was found guilty of lesser charges. The condemned men were informed of their sentences on December 10th. They had 1 night to write letters to their families. Corporal Charles Baltimore, the man whose beating had sparked the entire tragedy, wrote to his brother Frederick in Pennsylvania, "I write you for the last time in this world. I am to be executed tomorrow morning. I know this is shocking news, but don't worry too much, as it is God's will. Meet me in heaven. I was convicted in the general court-martial held here last month, was tried for mutiny and murder. It is true I went downtown with the men that marched out of camp, but I am innocent of shedding any blood." Private Thomas Hawkins wrote to his mother, "Dear mother and father, when this letter reaches you, I will be beyond the veil of sorrow. I will be in heaven with the angels. I am sentenced to be hanged for the trouble that happened in Houston, Texas, although I am not guilty of the crime that I am accused of. But mother, it is God's will that I go now, and in this way." What none of the condemned men knew was that their execution would happen with unprecedented speed. Early on the morning of December 11th, 1917, before sunrise, the 13 soldiers were taken from their barracks. They were transported to a hastily constructed gallows near Salado Creek, at a site on Camp Travis next to Fort Sam Houston. The execution had been kept secret. No media had been notified. No public announcement had been made. Even the War Department in Washington hadn't been informed. A soldier from the 19th Infantry, assigned to guard the condemned men, later described the scene. "The doomed men were taken off the trucks, not one making the slightest attempt to resist. They were shivering a little, but I think this was due more to the cold rather than fear. As they were escorted to the gallows, the soldiers sang hymns. They showed what witnesses described as remarkable courage and dignity." At sunrise on December 11th, 1917, 13 men were hanged. Sergeant William Nesbitt, Corporal Charles Baltimore, Corporal Jesse Moore, Corporal James Wheatley, Corporal Larson Brown, Private Thomas Hawkins, Private Frank Johnson, Private Ira Davis, Private James Devine, Private Carlos Snodgrass, Private Pat McWhorter, Private William Brackenridge, Private Rosalie Young. It was the largest mass execution of American soldiers by the U.S. Army in history. Their bodies were buried nearby in unmarked graves, identified only by numbers, 1 through 13. The execution wasn't formally announced until later that morning. When news broke, the reaction was immediate and furious. Military officials were outraged that soldiers had been executed without any review by the War Department or the President. Civilian leaders condemned the secrecy and haste. The NAACP launched an immediate investigation. The outcry was so intense that the Army made changes to prevent it from ever happening again. New regulations were implemented requiring all death sentences to be reviewed by the War Department and approved by the President before execution. Those regulations remain in place to this day, but the change came too late for the 13 men already dead. 2 more trials followed. The second trial, in December 1917, resulted in convictions for 52 more soldiers. 16 were sentenced to death. The third trial, in March 1918, convicted 23 of 40 defendants. 11 received death sentences. This time, the condemned men were allowed to appeal. President Woodrow Wilson, facing pressure from black leaders and civil rights organizations, commuted 10 of the death sentences to life imprisonment. On September 17, 1918, 6 more soldiers were hanged at the same gallows near Salado Creek. In total, 19 soldiers were executed. 63 received life sentences in federal prison. 110 were convicted of various charges. Not a single white civilian or police officer was ever charged with anything related to the events of August 23, 1917. Officer Lee Sparks, whose brutal assault on Baltimore had sparked the entire tragedy, hadn't even been on duty that night. He'd been at home, suspended for 24 hours because of his actions earlier that day. He survived without consequences. The 24th Infantry Regiment, despite its distinguished history, was not allowed to deploy to France to fight in World War I. The War Department considered the Houston incident disqualifying. While other American units fought in Europe, earning glory and recognition, the Buffalo soldiers of the 24th remained stateside, their reputation destroyed by one night in Houston. The executed soldiers were eventually reburied at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in 1937. 17 of them rest there today, their graves finally marked with proper headstones. 2 were returned to their families by request. For over a century, that's where the story ended. The largest mass execution in Army history. The largest murder trial in American history. A regiment's honor destroyed. Families devastated. Justice denied. But in October 2020, something changed. Professors and law students at South Texas College of Law, Houston, began reviewing the historical records. They studied the trial transcripts, examined the evidence, analyzed the procedures that had been followed. What they found confirmed what historians had known for decades. The trials had been fundamentally unfair. The students, working with historians and lawyers, prepared petitions asking the Army to review the convictions. They documented the serious irregularities, the rushed proceedings, the inadequate defense, the lack of physical evidence, the unreliable witness testimony, the climate of racial hostility that had pervaded every aspect of the case. In November 2023, after more than 106 years, the Army made an unprecedented announcement. Secretary of the Army Christine Wormuth approved the recommendation of the Army Board for Correction of Military Records to set aside all 110 convictions from the Houston Riot trials. The board found that the soldiers were wrongly treated because of their race and were not given fair trials. Every convicted soldier's military record was corrected to show an honorable discharge. Their families became eligible for survivors' benefits that had been denied for over a century. The Army acknowledged what should have been acknowledged in 1917. These soldiers never received justice. On February 22, 2024, new headstones were dedicated at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. For the first time, the executed soldiers' graves properly honor their service, with full names, ranks, units, and dates of death. An interpretive sign tells their story for visitors to read and understand. The story of the Houston Riot of 1917 is many things. It's a story about the impossible position of black soldiers serving a country that didn't value their humanity. It's about the brutality of Jim Crow and the violence required to maintain it. It's about what happens when human beings are pushed beyond endurance. It's about Sarah Travers, dragged barefoot from her home. About Private Alonzo Edwards, beaten for trying to help. About Corporal Charles Baltimore, shot at for asking a question. About 156 soldiers who believed they were about to be massacred and decided to march into Houston armed instead of waiting to die. It's about 4 police officers and 11 civilians who died that night, including a child. About Captain Matez, killed by friendly fire from soldiers who thought he was the enemy. About Sergeant Vida Henry, who led the march and then took his own life. About 4 soldiers cut down in the chaos. And it's about 13 men singing hymns as they walked to the gallows at sunrise. About 6 more hanged 9 months later. About 63 men sentenced to life in prison. About families who mourned for generations, while the Army called their loved ones criminals and mutineers. The Houston Riot happened because police brutality, racial hatred, and systematic dehumanization finally met their logical endpoint. Because the soldiers of the 24th Infantry were expected to serve a country that denied them basic dignity. Because in 1917, America, a black man in uniform, was still just a black man. And the uniform meant nothing when white authority decided to assert itself. The swift executions happened because the Army wanted to send a message. This is what happens when black soldiers resist. This is the price of fighting back. This is what mutiny costs. But 106 years later, the Army sent a different message. That justice delayed is not justice denied forever. That wrong convictions can be overturned even after a century. That the men of the 24th Infantry deserved better than they got in 1917. And their descendants deserve the truth. Corporal Charles Baltimore was innocent of shedding blood, just as he wrote in his final letter. The evidence doesn't support his execution. Neither does it support the execution of most of the others hanged with him. They died not because of what they'd done, but because of what they represented. Black soldiers who'd dared to believe that military service entitled them to basic human dignity. They were wrong about that in 1917. The question is whether America has learned anything in the century since. Whether we've truly reckoned with what happened that August night in Houston, and why it happened, and what it says about the country these men died trying to serve. 19 Buffalo soldiers were hanged for fighting back against police brutality and racial terror. It took 106 years for the Army to admit they never got a fair trial. Their convictions are overturned. Their service is now honored. But we can't give them back their lives. We can't undo the injustice. We can only remember and try to ensure that no soldiers ever again face the choice the men of the 24th Infantry faced in August 1917. Accept degradation and brutality without resistance, or fight back and face the gallows.